Professor, the Dean of Science wants to know how soon you can see him. He says he's tired of cooling his heels out here.
Tell him I'm cooling a couple of heels in here.
One of the things that are responsible for the rot that has set into today's academia, and the main reason they didn't want me there, is what is known as cultural Marxism. Now this is a term that is often being used, and often in the way that it should be used, that is, derisively, but the people throwing it around usually don't really know what it exactly means. In this video, we will try to explain cultural Marxism and expose it for what it is. So this is going to be a long video and we'll get into some heavy philosophy. And if you're not familiar with philosophy, it might not be easy to follow. But cultural Marxism affects all of our lives now, so it is important that we understand where it comes from if we want to effectively fight against it. I'm going to try my best to make it as clear as possible, and I hope that by the end of this video I can give you a better understanding of why cultural Marxism is so destructive, and why its proponents behave in such callous ways. Now, to understand cultural Marxism, we first need to talk about Marxism. And to talk about Marxism, we will first need to talk about Karl Marx. And to talk about Marx, we will first need to talk about dialectic thought, which means that we must first say something about the father of dialectic thought, the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Now, Hegel's philosophy is very hard and complicated, so I'm going to simplify it a great deal. But I just want us to understand the basics that we need in order to understand Marx and Marxism. Now, I realize that I am coming over as a bit condescending in suggesting that I need to simplify things for your understanding. So I'll tell you what, let's make a deal. I am going to read a paragraph out of Hegel's main book, The Phenomenology of Mind, and if after that you still feel like you don't need it to be simplified, you are welcome to navigate away from this video. If not, stick with me a while longer, okay? So, here we go, a Hegelian paragraph. Self-consciousness exists in itself and for itself, in that, and by the fact that it exists for another self-consciousness. That is to say, it is only by being acknowledged or recognized. The conception of this its unity in its duplication, of infinitude realizing itself in self-consciousness, has many sides to it and encloses within it elements of varied significance. Thus its moments must on the one hand be strictly kept apart in detailed distinctiveness, and, on the other, in this distinction must, at the same time, also be taken as not distinguished, or must always be accepted and understood in the opposite sense. This double meaning of what is distinguished lies in the nature of self-consciousness, of its being infinite, or directly the opposite of the determinateness in which it is fixed. The detailed exposition of the notion of this spiritual unity in its duplication will bring before us the process of recognition.
Do you follow me?
Yes?
Well, stop following me. I'll have you arrested.
Alright, so that was one paragraph, and the book is about 500 pages of that. So, are you still with me? Then let's simplify. Hegel philosophizes in the beginning of the 19th century, at the time of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a rebellion against the old feudal order, a demand to create a society where everyone is free and equal. Until then, it was believed that only in the afterlife can man achieve a perfect state, but 18th century thinkers changed that and claimed that man is capable of creating a utopian existence in this life. According to French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the nature of man is to live in a free and equal society, and it is only the current crooked systems of thought and government that prevent him from doing so. But if it is the nature of man to live in a utopian society, why did he create such crooked systems? Well, said the 18th century thinkers, that is because man first had to reach enlightenment, and enlightenment, as the German philosopher Immanuel Kant defined it, is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, whereas immaturity is defined by him as the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. So, according to Kant, until now man did not have the courage to think for himself, and relied on the guidance of religious and political leaders, thus imposing ignorance and oppression on himself. Once man starts to think for himself and realizes the truth about his existence, he will be able to devise a social system that will guarantee freedom, justice, and equality for all. So we must clean up our thinking from the lies that took root in it, learn to see the truth, and then we can create utopia on earth. This project is to free ourselves from lies and achieve truth, and as a result free ourselves from oppression and achieve a perfect state, was what became known as the project of enlightenment. Hegel comes shortly after Kant, and he presented a different view of how the perfect society is to be attained. While he agreed that the nature of man is to live in freedom and equality, he disagreed that he was capable of achieving it before. The perfect social order is an elaborate thing, and the human mind had to develop through history before it could reach the point where it was able to devise it. This historical progress is achieved in a dialectic process, in which a better order supersedes the order that came before it, but this better order could not have been thought by the human mind if the previous order didn't bring it to that point. To borrow an example from science, Einstein's theory negated and superseded Newton's theory, but Einstein could not have possibly come up with his theory if his mind wasn't already shaped by Newton's theory. So while the 18th century philosophers thought that the truth was always within our reach, from Hegel onwards we started to think in terms of progress. One mind alone cannot achieve the maturity that Kant spoke of. It must be a process that all humanity takes part in, until it matures and we all achieve enlightenment. For Hegel, the current and enlightened social order is not a self-imposed lie, as Kant would have it, but rather a partial truth, which is the best that humanity can come up with at this stage of its development. In the beginning of history, man came up with theories that were already partially true, and on their basis he devised a certain social order. This social order created a master class and a servant class, but because the nature of man is to live in freedom and equality, no one could be truly happy in this order. The servant class could not be happy because they were oppressed, and the master class could not be happy because they saw humanity being degraded when they were looking at their servants. This unhappy state would eventually prompt someone to come up with a better, truer theory, and over time this theory would spread to other minds, eventually bringing a revolution and a new social order to supersede the old order. This new order was still only partially true, and would still have a master class and a servant class, but it was less oppressive. For instance, the vassals of the feudal order were less oppressed than the slaves of the past. But it was still an oppressive system, so eventually someone would come up with a better theory. As we can see, the progress of humanity, according to Hegel, takes place on two planes: the theoretical plane of the mind, which thinks up new theories and systems, and the practical plane of human society. The dialectic movement is achieved when an individual mind thinks up a better theory, and then it spreads to other minds. Eventually this brings a change in society, which is taken to a higher, more elaborate and less oppressive order. Minds that are born into this higher order are then at a point where they can think up an even better order, and so forth until the perfect social order is achieved. When will this happen? Well, according to Hegel, on the plane of the mind it already happened. The human mind achieved full maturation in the 18th century, when it came up with representative democracy, capitalist economy, and Enlightenment values. In the order built on these systems and ideas, there are no longer masters and servants, but everyone is both a master and a servant. I serve you when you are my customer, and you serve me when I am your customer. So we are all servants, in that we labor to maintain our society, but we are actually serving ourselves, because in this liberal democratic society we are all masters of our own fate. And for Hegel, this is what defined the free society. All that was left now was for these ideas to spread and become a social order all over the world, and then humanity will be free. 200 years later, Hegel has yet to be proven wrong. Liberal democracy and free market economy still characterize what today we define as a free society, and over the past 2 centuries this model has gradually improved and spread over half the globe. Those of us who live in it are so accustomed to it by now that we take it for granted, and we don't appreciate just how elaborate and clever these systems are, and what a feat of the human mind it was to devise them. To date, no one has been able to successfully devise a system that works better, but there has been at least one serious attempt to think of a system that works better, and it came from the mind of Karl Marx. Marx came out of the school of dialectic thought founded by Hegel. If you read his later writings, like the Capital, they read very much like the paragraph from Hegel I quoted before. His early writings from the 1840s, like the Communist Manifesto, are easier to understand, but again I'm going to simplify his philosophy for our purpose. Marx may have been Hegel's disciple, but he disagreed with his claim that man has achieved his full maturation. Hegel, claimed Marx, erroneously looked at the mind as the thing that drives man's history, when in fact it is driven by man's material situation. Every stage in history has its own economic system, a system that creates 2 classes of people and an uneven distribution of wealth. The servant class does most of the labor that creates the wealth, and the master class then enjoys most of it. When a new economic system is established, it gradually changes the minds of the people living in it, making them capable of thinking up a better system. This economic system also gradually improves its means of production, and increases the wealth, creating the practical possibility to establish a better system, one that is more equal and creates even greater wealth. It also increases the disparity of wealth, and eventually this disparity becomes so great that it can no longer be contained, prompting a revolution that creates a better system. The end of man's development through history, according to Marx, will come only when we are in a system where everyone gets to work equally and share the wealth equally. It is a popular notion that Marx was anti-capitalist, but that's not entirely true. Remember that he believed that history progresses in a dialectic process, meaning that later systems are better than what came before. Marx actually gives capitalism the credit for the spread of Enlightenment values, for the destruction of old oppressive systems like the feudal system and theocratic rule. What capitalism also did was strip the oppressive relationship between people of all its religious and political garments, and exposed it for what it is, a system based on exploitation and profit, where the employer uses the labor of the worker to create commodities which he then sells for high price, while giving his employee only pittance of the wealth he makes. The capitalist system has thus split humanity into two classes: the master class of employers, also known as the bourgeoisie, or the middle class, and the servant class of employees, also known as the proletariat, or the working class. Marx predicted that capitalism will spread all over the globe, destroying the cultural differences between people and creating a global working class of like-minded workers. At the same time, it will create enormous wealth, which will allow humanity to devise a system where we won't have to work so much. But the middle class, driven by greed, will not agree to such a system and would rather continue to exploit the workers and work them even harder, creating an ever-increasing wealth gap. Eventually, the working class will not be able to take it anymore, but will unite and bring about a revolution that will abolish the capitalist system and create a world with no commodities, no money and no possessions, where everyone shares the wealth. At this point there will be no need for government, because man will live according to his nature, and utopia will prevail. So Marx believed that we are one step away from achieving utopia. What was this belief based on? Well, if we look into it, we will find that it wasn't really based on any rational reason. It's just that the perception after Hegel was that we've already reached full maturation, and Marx said, hold on, there is one more step needed. And because of this belief, Marx blames capitalism for all the problems that are still left in the world: hunger, crime, wars, injustice, and so forth. Abolish the capitalist system, and all of these problems will disappear. And this belief would have horrendous results, for Marx and for the world, because it is this idea, which Marxists have blind faith in, that was at the basis of all the terrible crimes later done in Marx's name. If capitalism is responsible for all the wrongs in the world, then any means are sacred in the fight to abolish it. Marxists are therefore not bothered by trying to solve individual cases of injustice or poverty. All of the energy is dedicated to bringing down the capitalist system. They believe that they are on the right side of history, and that this fact gives them more license to do anything they deem necessary to speed up its progress, because history will exonerate them once utopia is achieved. Alas, every attempt so far to create a Marxist utopia in practice has been a resounding failure. The Marxist excuse for it is that these attempts were premature. They were all performed in places where the capitalist stage did not yet get to the point where a communist revolution could be successful. However, what these Marxists refuse to acknowledge is that there have been at least three things that happened since the time of Marx that completely pulled the rug from under Marx's logic. First, the realization that man is an ape. The assumption at the basis of Marxism is that man is a being of benevolent nature, and it's just the current system he dwells in that corrupts that nature. This assumption originates from Christianity, from the belief that man has fallen from heaven into this world. Marx, despite being an atheist, adopted this assumption that the nature of man is heavenly, and so he could believe that utopia will prevail once the crooked capitalist system is removed. But once we've realized man comes from the ape, there are no grounds for such an assumption. Marxism presumes to be a rational theory, but its core belief is nothing but a superstition. unemployment benefits, and many other rights which today we take for granted. Life for the working class is quite comfortable now, and yet all the problems that were supposed to be solved still persist. In such a reality, it takes blind faith in Marxism to keep on believing that workers' conditions are the source of every problem in the world. So here too, Marxism is exposed as based on nothing but more than by our working identity. In previous centuries, if your name was Taylor, it probably meant that you belonged to a family of tailors. From the day you were born, you were destined to be a tailor until the day that you died. Your occupation was the thing that defined you. So if you were being exploited in that identity, it was logical to say, as Marx did, that you were being oppressed. Today, however, you are no longer defined by your occupation. Most of us define ourselves more by identities that revolve around our hobbies, our interests, and our pleasures. This is our world now, whereas our occupation is just something that we do to finance our true identities. So if I show you that you are being underpaid in your job, of course you are not going to like it. You will feel like you're being screwed.
You check, sir. $9.40? This is an outrage. If I were you, I wouldn't pay it.
But you will not feel like you're being oppressed. You do not define yourself by your occupation, so being exploited in it is only a matter of justice, not a matter of freedom. But for Marxists, the reality is very different. Since Marxism characterizes the capitalist stage as a stage where people are defined by their occupation, Marxists are incapable of accepting that these changes occurred while we are still in the capitalist stage. They believe that we are all still defined by our occupation, which means that we are all still oppressed. And we are even more oppressed than we were during Marx's time, since the wealth increased astronomically, and the disparity between the overall wealth in the world and what the average worker makes is much greater. So why is it that the workers don't rise up in revolt, as Marx predicted? Because, say the Marxists, the capitalist system is a sneaky one. It has made social reforms to make the workers' life more comfortable, and provides the workers with a lot of temptations in their leisure time to distract them from thinking about their oppressed condition. In other words, Marxists do not accept today's leisure-based identities as authentic. They see them all as a manifestation of a false consciousness, a consciousness of people who have been conditioned by the capitalist system to live against their nature. The Marxists believe that only they can see the truth, while the rest of us are blind sheep. So, while Marx saw both good and bad in capitalism, Marxists see it as totally evil. They regard it as a system that is deviously holding on to its power and sedating the masses so they will never rise up and overthrow it. This has driven Marxists to the belief that they should use violence in order to free us from the system, and to all the horrors that were done in the name of Marxism in the 20th century. The crime of Marxists against humanity are well documented and discussed, but what is rarely being discussed is the harm that Marxism does to the Marxists themselves. Since they believe that everything in our world is a manifestation of the evil capitalist system, they feel alienated to their existence in it, and cannot enjoy any part of it. I've never met a happy Marxist. They are usually very bitter people, frustrated by life, often depressed and occasionally downright hateful. While they keep telling themselves that they are on the right side of history, history itself keeps moving in a direction opposite to their predictions, and their frustration and alienation gets even deeper. The blind faith in Marxist superstition is denying them the ability to enjoy their existence. One such Marxist was Theodor Adorno, a mid-20th century philosopher. Adorno despised popular culture and all the wonderful things it has to offer. Instead, he glorified the music of Arnold Schoenberg, and said that this is the music of the future. Let me play you some Schoenberg, so you can appreciate the majesty of his music.
Der Dichter, den die Andacht treibt, berauscht sich an den heiligen Tranke. Gen Himmel wendet verzückt das Haupt. Und Taumeln sucht und schluft den Wein, den Mann mit Augen drängt.
You sing a high, huh?
Yes, I have a falsetto voice.
That's a funny. My last pupil, she got a false set of teeth.
Now, I'm not saying that this music has no merit. To be honest, I actually like this piece. Experimental avant-garde art has its own value, and can open your mind in many ways. But when you make it the only music that you value, and reject ecstasy, rhythm, sexiness, fun, and everything else that is so great about music, you are denying yourself some of the most powerful joys of life. Of course, Marxists don't really distance themselves completely from all the joys today's world has to offer, but they cannot enjoy them without feeling guilt. Because what Marxism is when all said and done, is nothing more than the residue of Christianity in the atheist sphere. The Christians see this world as a prison they have to liberate themselves from to get to heaven, so every time they partake in its simple joys they feel guilt for helping the devil in his work. Marxism has internalized this perception of the world as a prison, and just reimagined it with different concepts, so whenever a Marxist partake in its joys they feel guilt for helping the capitalist system, their version of the devil. And so, Marxists are alienated and bitter about the world, and their only real joy is when they can escape it for a while and dream about the communist utopia. Thankfully, by the 1980s almost every human with half a brain could see that Marxism is based on no more than superstitions, and Marxism was totally discredited. But it didn't die completely, and eventually it found a way to creep back into academic discourse by latching onto identity politics. In my video about identity politics, I showed that originally it made sense, because it was people from discriminated groups banding together to fight against discrimination. But I also showed that their battles have essentially been won, and now identity politics have been taken over by the regressive left, which uses it for its purposes. The regressive left is based not only on Marxism, but brings together several strands of thought, but we shall leave the other strands to future videos. In this video, I will focus only on the mixture of identity politics and Marxism, which produced the abomination known as cultural Marxism. For anyone familiar with the regressive left, it should be quite obvious by now what place Marxist thought takes in it. Basically, it has adopted the Marxist dogma but replaced capitalism with patriarchy. The patriarchy is a system which is designed to maintain the dominance of the heterosexual cis white male, but exists nowhere except in the mind of the cultural Marxists. Just like traditional Marxists, they believe that the patriarchy is to blame for all the problems in the world, and that utopia will prevail once the patriarchy is brought down. They have absolutely no rational basis for this belief. It is just a residue of Marxism in today's leftist thinking, a blind faith in the idea that we are one step away from utopia. That explains why cultural Marxists seem to disregard any moral value in the pursuit of their goal. Just like traditional Marxists, they believe that history will exonerate them, and when utopia is achieved we will all see how right they were and thank them. The Marxist mindset also explains why regressive leftists seem so obsessed with identifying people by the group they belong to. For the rest of us, it seems like they are the only ones left who care about such things, while Western society already transcended such distinctions. But, just like traditional Marxists believe that the nature of capitalism is to define everyone by their working identity, the cultural Marxists believe that the patriarchy defines everyone by their race, gender, and sexual orientation. It's not that the cultural Marxists think that people should be defined by these identities, but rather the opposite. They want to free the world of such definitions. But they don't believe this can happen as long as the patriarchy exists, so they believe that we are all still thinking according to these definitions, and that we are only deluding ourselves to think that we have transcended them. That is why the cultural Marxists will never take your statement on face value, but will believe that what is speaking is actually your racism, sexism, and homophobia, even if you are not aware of it. Only they can see the truth, so it is their duty to wake the rest of us up to the realization that we are still defined by these identities. But, just like with traditional Marxists, most people simply refuse to buy what the cultural Marxists are selling, and they remain alienated from society. Once again, we find the same outcome. The cultural Marxists become frustrated and resentful, and lash out at the world that refuses to bend itself to their ideology. If you thought the Schoenberg piece I played before was bad, try this out. A feminist opera that was put on stage last year. This is what cultural Marxism is. A mind screeching in pain, unable to contain its resentment, alienation, and hate of the world. In their dreams of heaven on earth, they have turned their own mind into their own personal hell.